Hey, Doug.
Do I?
Oh, actually, no. I should be.
You should.
Yeah.
I
No.
believe you should be set up as a presenter.
Yeah, 1 sec here.
Otherwise, I will find that out. Yeah, I don't have that option with your account.
That's right. Let's see how this works here.
If you can take over there for a moment, but I do have a couple intro slides I want to run through.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Yeah. Do you want to go through your intro slides, and I'll start presenting and start going here.
Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Doug Wilson. I am one of the moderators and board members of the MN365 user group. So I do really appreciate everybody being here today. Hopefully everybody had a great morning with the first session. And just a few notes today, if I can find my actual slide deck controller. So of course, virtual meeting. We do record these meetings just to make sure our attendees, if they miss anything or want to review, they're able to go back through this. I definitely ask, please mute yourself prior to our presenter starting. It is just a very nice courtesy thing to do. And if you have questions, comments, raise your hand, or if Michael's okay with it, you can come off mute at an appropriate time to ask that question or put it in chat. Michael and I both will be monitoring that, or I definitely will be. If Michael gets time, I think he said he would be checking that as well. If you need live captioning, definitely there's an option in Teams that helps out with that. And then we'll be asking, or we will be giving away $25 gift cards at the end of every session. And it's really built off your interactions or comments. So if you want to be quiet, you can definitely put the questions in chat. It's just kind of a random giveaway at that point that I pull from at the end of the event today. We'll have a grand prize giveaway, and that'll be based on our survey feedback. And then, of course, always want to thank our sponsors, RBA Concurrency, Cyber Advisors, Sky North. They definitely help us put on these types of events. Just, again, we do this for the community, so it's always very helpful. Link to our survey here. And the survey is built throughout the day, so definitely as you're going through it and you want to have the best notes available for our speakers and us as our user group, feel free to fill this out as you're going through sessions all day. And with that, I'll introduce Michael.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
Everyone. Give me 1 second here. Let me just share my slide deck here. And then, no, it doesn't want to do it. Hang on, let's try this again here. Come on, PowerPoint Live. There we go.
There, nice.
Second time's a charm. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to this first session, right? First session after the keynote. So my name is Michael Pisarek, and we are going to talk about everyone's favorite word today, starting with G. So governance for Microsoft Teams. So we've got 90 minutes. There's a lot of people on the call. I actually don't mind if you use this as a way to get as much free advice and consulting from me as possible. I would love to make it as interactive as possible. So if you have any questions, just put them within the comments, raise your hands. I'll be monitoring this as well on this right-hand side. So if you see my eyes dart to the right, that's why. But yeah, definitely let me know if you have any questions or any comments. Like I said, we have 90 minutes, so much better to make this interactive rather than me just kind of talking for the next hour and a half. So I am Michael, 7 times Microsoft SharePoint MVP, lots of experience within the Microsoft 365 stack. I have a couple of different roles. So I have a company at the moment called Orchestry. So we are a governance and adoption platform for Microsoft 365. Previously to this, I was the CEO of a company called Bonsai Intranet. So we were one of the largest intranet in a box vendors. We got acquired in early 2018. Really, we kind of rode that wave and were one of the first companies to do the intranet in a box thing on Microsoft 365. Got to work with some amazing customers. We did the intranet for companies like Macy's, Expedia, and AMD. 2 of our customers won Nielsen Norman Intranet Awards also using Bonsai. But then we got acquired in 2018. I had a dog and a baby. In that order, and then really kind of launched another product called Orchestry. So We are, I'm not going to kind of harp on about this, but we're a governance and adoption and lifecycle management platform on Microsoft 365. Really, what's interesting or might be interesting to you is, we have a lot of customers, and we probably look at 700,000-ish teams every single night across all of our customers. So we have a pretty good understanding, we think, of what's going on there within the Microsoft 365 realm, particularly when it comes to governance and adoption on Microsoft Teams. So you're probably going to get a lot of those insights today. Unlike someone who's maybe just a consultant and work with a few customers, we have a pretty broad set of a pretty broad understanding of kind of what's going on out there. So for an agenda for today, first thing we're going to talk about is some session goals. Just so you know, and I'm going to give you an out. You want to get out of the session because you might think this is, an advanced PowerShell programming course or something like that. It definitely isn't. So we're going to go through some session goals first, and then we're going to take it in kind of 3 levels here. So the first thing we're going to talk about is really strategy around governance. Far too many organizations that we deal with tend to dive into the weeds around governance and want to start configuring all of these capabilities and pieces without really understanding why they're doing it. So that strategy component has a really, really key role. So we're going to talk about some of the pieces you need to do first before you start thinking about going into the Teams Admin Center or talking about provisioning or lifecycle management or any of those things. Then we're going to take it a level down and talk about how governance can actually be implemented in Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams. There's going to be lots of examples here. The real problem is there's no kind of governance center in Microsoft 365, right? I know that might be frustrating for you as admins or maybe users, but unfortunately, like the rest of Microsoft 365, there's kind of a lot of areas, right? You have to go and do some things here and do some things here and some things here. I'm going to try to make it apparent where you should go to do particular things. The really nice thing, though, is there is a lot of capabilities to manage and configure governance in Microsoft 365 and in particular Microsoft Teams just by using the native UI. So you don't have to use PowerShell, you don't have to use custom code. There's a lot there. And then the last probably 2/3 of this presentation is really around what we call pragmatic governance examples. So I don't know about you, but I don't like going to sessions where people just kind of talk philosophy. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to implement some of these particular governance use cases. And the way that we're going to do it is a little bit different because we're going to take the role of 3 different organizations. So one of them is going to be called Lockdown Corp, which wants to have a very locked down type of governance approach. All the way on the other side, we're going to take the approach that Startup Inc. would take. Startup Inc. is going to take the approach where everything is going to be very, very open. And then in the middle, we're going to have Balanced Industries. And Balanced Industries is going to take that balanced approach. And the idea with this is to give you an understanding of just how much flexibility you have and what you can do. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense to everyone. And as I said, feel free to stop me, jump in. If you want to jump off mute and shout questions, I'm all good with that as well. So just let me know. All right, so some session goals for today. First thing we're going to do, kind of educate you broadly of what governance means. Problem with governance is you ask 10 different people, you get 20 different answers, right? So we really want a level set of kind of what governance means and how you can communicate it to your organization or to your IT team or to your executives. It is a frequent problem that if you talk about governance, people have a very different view and a very different opinion of what that might be. Next thing we're going to talk about is some of the options that Microsoft 365 provides. We're not going to go through all of them. Otherwise, instead of this being a 90-minute session, this is going to be like a 900-minute session, right? There's just so much there within Microsoft 365. But we're going to see if we can tackle those pieces that are going to give you the most value and typically where most organizations would want to start from a governance perspective. Things like provisioning, naming policies, lifecycle management, available apps, all of these pieces we'll talk about. Then what we're going to do is, like I said, show you these scenarios in action. And the goal is at the end of this, at least you get a couple of nuggets of information that you can go back to your organization and start implementing straight away. So like I said, it's going to be a little bit of philosophy, lots of information, but also some pragmatic doing and some clicking around the Teams Admin Center if we get there also. All right, let's get rocking and rolling here. So let's talk about governance and strategy first in Teams and Microsoft 365. Let's first really talk about it from that strategic perspective, right? Because that's really what you want to do. So the typical governance plan, like I said, when we work with organizations around governance, too many organizations tend to rush in and try to go and start implementing things without really understanding what they're doing or why, right? What you really want to do is first understand and have a governance plan that sits outside of Microsoft 365. The whole idea with governance, in my mind, is to drive adoption. I really view governance and user adoption as two sides of the same coin. The whole idea would be you want to give users as much leeway as you can, but also making sure that you adhere to any policies, rules, legal precedents that you have within your organization to make sure that you have that balance. Lots of companies go down an either or approach. We find either they just leave everything open, which is the default approach, or they get worried and lock everything down. So users can't create groups and they can't create teams, and it has to go through a process. Like I said, we think the balance is somewhere in the middle. So before you start all of that, you need to go through the process of developing a governance plan. And a governance plan typically involves not particularly fun work, but it is really, really useful. It's the roles, the responsibilities, the processes that you want to implement within Microsoft Teams. So typical governance plan that we have, defining different roles within the organization, right? So who's responsible for what? Who's going to be responsible for Teams? Admin, for instance, can be a really tricky question because, like I said, Teams admin involves lots of different capabilities within Microsoft 365, but defining those roles, what are IT, what's an end user, what's an admin, what's a team owner, what's a team member, all of those pieces. The next is really defining the responsibilities for each one of those roles. So what can team owners do? What can team members do? What are they responsible for? Those pieces. The third thing that we also do is around the processes that you want to implement from a governance perspective. The typical ones that you want to look at, and most organizations start off with, is definitely around the creation, the archival, and the deletion of teams, right? Those three pieces, because it's kind of, the largest set of the life cycle, can be really, really important. And once again, you should start to think about how you want to implement those before you start going into M365. Then access and ownership. Like, again, this can be a bit of a tricky question because Teams spans so many capabilities within Microsoft 365. But ultimately, most organizations will want to have something like a platform owner for Teams. It can be a group of people. We're seeing that more and more, particularly with larger organizations. But again, you want to document that down as well, and policies as well. Now, the idea with governance and what can governance help you with is actually quite a lot of things, right? Typically or traditionally, I think most people look at governance from a compliance perspective, really compliance and security. So if you have any security or any kind of compliance laws, right, things, legal laws, social, cultural, SOC 2 compliance, for instance, typically they can be main drivers within your governance plan. But also governance can help you do a lot more. One of the ways is really around from an adoption perspective also. So we find that in a lot of organizations, just letting people do whatever they want in Microsoft Teams, giving them all of the capabilities all at once, really doesn't drive really good user adoption. We can control some of the features and some of the capabilities that users have using some of these governance policies. The other big thing that we're seeing, particularly from a governance perspective, and a huge challenge for most customers that we see, is around what we call Microsoft Teams sprawl. So the typical thing that we're seeing, and if anyone has experienced this, feel free to put a comment in or raise your hand, is lots of organizations, because of COVID, their Microsoft Teams kind of rollout went from 6 months to 2 days, typically over a weekend, right? Everyone went remote. People were like, oh my God, we need to keep working, so let's roll out this piece of technology here. By default, if you don't do anything in Microsoft 365, everything is very, very open. So people can create teams and SharePoint sites and groups whenever they want, however they want. They can call them whatever they want either, and you start to get sprawl. Now, you know, if you have sprawl, for instance, if you have common things like A, you can't find anything. B, you might have 10 teams called the same thing. So because I can go into Microsoft Teams and create 20 teams called human resources, which seems insane, but it is possible to do, right? You start to find that you get all of these duplicated teams. You start to get a huge amount of sprawl. You start to get the really typical thing where if I go in and I create a team for a project, for instance, maybe I only add half of the project team. We start working in that team for a couple of days. Someone else who's also wants to join the project looks for the team. Because the team's private, they can't find it. They assume that it doesn't exist. So they create another team, typically with the same name, and they start working in there as well. And now you have two teams, but kind of the same purpose, until you actually realize, oh God, there's actually two teams. Now we have to merge them together, and there's no concept of a merged team there. So again, from a governance perspective, particularly from the creation side and the management piece around governance, it can really help sprawl and duplication. And then the other big one here as well is really stopping information leaks. So again, from a governance perspective, things like security and guest access are really, really key things that you might want to look at. The other thing, which is also going to be something that I know a lot of organizations are really excited about and are looking at, is also going to be around shared channels. Now, I can tell you that shared channels, especially if you want to work with external organizations, there has to be a lot of governance planning that goes into that, because whilst it seems fairly easy and simple, right, what's going to happen is if you open up this federation between shared channels, you are going to go and you're going to give maybe a little bit more access than you might want to. Now, if you have questions about shared channels, we can talk about it at the end. But I would say first tip, if you are looking at shared channels, really closely read the Microsoft documentation and just know what you're getting yourself in for, particularly not internally. You can use shared channels internally, which is good, but externally, if you're going to start federating with external organizations, make sure you understand some of the impacts of that, because there are significant impacts with setting up that B2B federation between organizations. All right, now, the reason that governance is so difficult and there's no governance center and there's no kind of governance checklist is because every organization is different, right? And really, there's kind of where you fit is going to be somewhere on what we call this governance spectrum. Now, at the two extremes is on the left-hand side where you have everything completely locked down. Okay, so essentially what you're going to do from a governance side, you don't want people to be able to create teams or groups or SharePoint sites, for instance. So what you're going to do is lock everything down, and they have to go through some form of process. For larger organizations, maybe you want to use a tool like ServiceNow. Maybe you want to use a tool like we provide, Orchestrate, but there's lots of other third-party tools available. Lots of people create their own Power Apps. But essentially, if you want to go, if a user wants to request a team, a SharePoint site, a group, a plan, they have to go through a controlled process. On the other side is this limited control. And in this case, this is where users can go and create anything, anywhere. Now, just so you know, that is the default out-of-the-box configuration that you get with Microsoft 365. So a lot of organizations might be very, very stringent and strict from a security perspective, or they think they are from a governance perspective. But if you haven't gone in and changed any of the default options, essentially you are running that anyone can go and create anything anywhere, right? So just keep that in mind. But where you're going to fit as an organization is somewhere within the spectrum here, right? And like I said, there's no right answer for every organization. There's probably going to be a right answer for your organization. And it'll also change over time as well. So we see for a lot of companies, they might start off in a bit more of a tightly controlled manner, right? And then over time, as they get adoption, the users understand the platform, they start to loosen the reins a little bit going forward. And I'll show you how you can make that happen also. Now, what happens with no governance? So it's time for some stats. So we have a lot of customers who come to us when they didn't have time to implement governance. So these are actually some true real stats. So this was a company, they implemented Microsoft Teams. They didn't have time to do governance planning because it was COVID and it was super busy. So they just let it go with the out-of-the-box options. So as you can see, lots of teams, right? Lots of growth within teams also. I think when we started working with them, I think it was like August, and I think they were up to like 5.5 single kind of thousand teams. So lots of teams. Now, when we started looking at this, we see some pretty broad patterns across most of our customers. A lot of organizations are deploying teams and users are requesting teams, but they're not really using teams, if that makes sense. They're creating these teams. They're using teams as a way to get into their SharePoint files, but they're not using any of the fantastic capabilities that Teams provides. Additional channels, additional tabs, additional apps, all of that stuff. So again, that's a really big missed opportunity. From a governance perspective, particularly if you allow people to create their own teams, the amount of teams we see with testing, demo, temp, people's names within the teams, right? Where someone goes in, they're interested. I'm the sort of person that our IT organizations would basically hate, where you come in, I would create a team called Michael's Lunch Test. I would use it maybe for 5-10 minutes. Maybe I use it for a day. And then, like I said, you never kind of use it again also. So we tend to see a lot of that. We also tend to see some real issues around what we call ownerless and memberless teams. And one of the things is because when someone goes and requests a team, by default, you only require a single owner. When that person leaves, what happens is that team essentially becomes ownerless. So members can't do a lot of the things. They also have no owner to talk to. But the bigger challenge, particularly with the ownerless teams, is more around just who owns the content within the team, right? Because there's just no one there, and kind of lots of other challenges as well. So what we are seeing across lots of different customers, lots of industries, lots of kind of verticals is, like I said, without any governance planning, you start to see sprawl, you start to see duplication of content. The amount of companies that I've spoken to, when I ask them which is the marketing team, and you've got like 15 different marketing teams there because they could be a pretty large multinational, is really concerning. But again, that's the type of thing that might happen. So just before we kind of finish this off, why would you kind of bother going down this particular route here? Again, particularly in Teams, out of the box, every single feature is going to be enabled, right? And you might not necessarily want to make all these capabilities enabled for your organization. So the way that I try to think about it is, without any governance, it's like giving your end users an iPhone, but you really have no idea what you're doing. So you're like, we'll just download every single app from the iPhone App Store and we're going to give it to our users here, right? Again, you can control what users can do and how they can do it really easy and really simple. Again, no custom codes needed. We'll go into that. And I think the reason that most organizations don't, it's just this big kind of hairy topic which users don't know how to approach. Now, where to get started, apart from a presentation like this, probably the best place I find, if you want to get started with this, let me click through here. There we go, tremendous. If you go to the Teams Adoption Hub in aka.ms/Teams Adoption, in step 2 here, let me get the old highlighter. Let me get the laser pointer out. So in step 2 here, there's a governance quick start just here under the experiment. It is really good. It's very simple. It's very easy, but it's going to take you through those kind of processes here also. All right, and we have some questions on the right-hand side, which is awesome. Marie, can you speak how to scale back sprawl vis-a-vis Teams and the data? And Ed got an answer here. Yeah, okay, so stopping sprawl, right. So there's two parts of this depending on where you are in the sprawl journey, but it sounds like Maria and scale back sprawl. Okay, so there's 2 things you need to do. The first thing is, if you are experiencing sprawl, what you need to do is have some sort of process around provisioning, right? Now, typically what that's going to involve is stopping people from creating Teams and SharePoint sites and getting them to go through a process. So that's one way to essentially do it. You can look at a Power App, you can look at custom code, you can look at something like Orchestra also. But having that ability for a kind of a bit of a quick check before a team gets created. The other thing, though, that we find is in a lot of cases, people create duplicate teams because, as you know, if I am not a member of a team and I search for it, right, I won't find that. And the problem is everyone seems to create every single team as private. It just have the way that people are, even though there's no reason for these teams to be created as private teams, they do. So one of the ways you can get around that is either encourage people to create public teams, which is a little bit difficult. But the other thing that we see a lot of companies do, and we have this within Orchestra, is this concept of like a team or a workspace directory, where users can maybe see teams or SharePoint sites that they're not members of, and they can request access to that site from there before they go and create another team called, let's say, marketing or human resources. So you want to take care of the kind of the provisioning side. You also want to clean it up, right? Now, the problem is, especially with duplicate or sprawled teams, there's no real easy way to start merging these things together. With documents, it's a little bit easier, but there's no concept with Microsoft 365 out of the box to say, well, we've got, you know, two teams, just take all of the conversations and move all of the conversations or the channels and just kind of merge them together. It can be a little bit difficult to do. It's a little bit easier with documents. You can just move the documents over, so that's not that difficult. But there's no real way to kind of merge conversations over, and that's one of the reasons, like I said, where I'm a big fan of having a little bit more control in that provisioning process. Like I said, during that process, maybe checking for duplicate teams, maybe it goes through a little bit of an approval process also. So like I'd say, so you don't end up with 10 or 15 teams called marketing and everything else. And Marie, let me know, or anyone else, let me know if that helps answer that, or if I'm just rambling here because it's early. All right.
No, that helps. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Marie. Thanks for jumping on. It's great. It's like there's real humans on this call. Awesome. All right. So let's keep rocking and rolling here. Now that we know about the strategy piece, right? So let's say you come down, we have this strategy document. We want to, like Marie, right? So like Marie has done her governance document now. She's got this beautiful provisioning process there. How is this stuff actually implemented within Microsoft 365, right? Like, what are the knobs? What are the things that you as IT admins need to be able to kind of tweak and make all of this happen? So the first thing, particularly around teams, is you have to govern Office 365 or Microsoft 365 groups, right? The reason this gets really, really complicated is because teams and groups and everything in Microsoft, right, is essentially, like I said, really tightly and closely combined together. And the problem is that if you look at teams from kind of an overall perspective and from a governance perspective, some of the stuff is configured at the team level, some of the stuff is configured at the group level, some of the stuff is configured at the SharePoint level, some of the stuff is configured outside of all of that at the compliance level, for instance. But the first thing really, if you want to start to govern teams, the team's creation process, teams lifecycle management, renewals and archives, you really need to understand Microsoft 365 groups. I'm not going to go through it too much here because again, there's a lot there, but just understand the subtle interplay between teams and Microsoft 365 groups. But in terms of the settings, it gets a little bit less confusing because there's kind of really three settings, right? That gets when you look at teams. Now, this is a very simplistic version of this. Like I said, there's a bunch there, but let's just keep it simple. From teams in particular, there's kind of three main settings that you can look at apply from that governance journey. So the first thing is at the team level. So you've got lots of various rules you can apply at the actual team itself. The second is around the groups level. So thing at the group level is things like inactivity to help sprawl and archiving, naming policies, and also provisioning. That's all done actually at the Microsoft 365 group level. And then the last thing is really around the security and compliance. And there's a bunch of stuff there. Things like sensitivity labels, access, retention labels, all of these pieces also. On the team side, though, through the Teams Admin Center, there's really kind of a structure that Microsoft follows. So there's what are called global settings, or sorry, there's what are called settings, which are kind of global, and then you have policies which can apply to individual users or groups of users also. So you can kind of have like a default setting, and you can also have individual policies there. In terms of kind of where the settings apply to, typically, like I said, they're either global for everyone, or you have these individual groups. Now, what this means is you've got a lot of flexibility here, right? So you can have a default setting, but you might want to have an individual policy that's applied to a subset of users or individual users or everything else. In terms of just the small smattering of governance controls within teams, there is a lot there, right? This is just really the stuff that comes from, let's say, the Teams admin center and a little bit of the groups pieces also. When you start to look at all of the things from the security and compliance center and everything else, it's a huge kind of breadth and swath of things. But really, these are probably the areas that you want to look at. And I think some of them have been mentioned within the comments already, but there's a number of really good settings. So one of them is around apps, right? There's 3 different settings around apps. So application org-wide settings, setup policies, as well as permission policies. We will be discussing these in a little bit more depth. These helps you control the apps that your users have access to within Microsoft 365, both internally, so the apps that you provide, something like Microsoft Viva. And when I'm talking about apps, I'm talking about the stuff on the left-hand side of the Teams rail there, in addition to any external third-party apps that you have. There's also a ton of settings around meetings, right? What people can do in meetings, what they can share, all of these pieces. Also, once again, meeting policies as well as meeting settings. Naming policies, this is applied at the group level. This is one of these items that's applied at the group. But again, from a naming policies perspective, you can have a little bit of control in terms of how those groups and how those teams are named. And the other thing as well, for a lot of you and for a lot of our customers and users, is around guest access, right? So are you going to enable guests? What can guests do? And any lifecycle pieces around guests also. And then all of these other pieces, right? So members and guest settings, what members and guests can do, policies, classifications, all of this other stuff as well. So with all of this, where do you want to start? So I think that this is a pretty good place to start. And I think we've talked about some of these already. But what I would recommend is starting with kind of at least one of these first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One of these kind of first 7 things. We're going to go through all of these in a little bit more depth. So again, from a governance perspective, the first thing that we find that organizations really want to start and understand is around that creation or that provisioning process, right? So who can create teams, who can create SharePoint sites, who can create groups, who can create, shared libraries, all of that stuff. That provisioning process is probably the way and the area that most organizations start off with. It really does make a lot of sense, because once again, you can stop sprawl and duplication and all of these issues from the very beginning. The next one is around naming conventions also. As you probably know, people are very bad at naming things, terribly bad at naming things, right? They kind of name things very oddly, very strangely. If you don't believe me, go look into a file share, right, and see kind of just how people name folders and stuff. The same sort of thing happens within teams. So again, you can have a governance policy that users have to follow when they name a team or a SharePoint site. Traditionally, if you're relying on users to read the policy and then do that, when they're in the process of requesting or creating a team, like I said, I don't think that works necessarily very well, but you can automate that process. And out of the box in Microsoft 365, there is what's called a naming policy that you can apply to it. You can have things like prefixes and suffixes, and even block particular words, right? So that ability to block them are really important. The other one is around guest access also. So guest access, and pretty soon it's going to be external access if you are going to implement shared channels, is also something that could be really important. Again, are you going to allow guests, right? Are you going to, what can guests do? How guests get invited? Which groups have access to guests? All of those pieces also. The fourth thing that I would encourage you to do as well is around expiry. And I noticed on the chat here on the right-hand side, we've talked about this a little bit also. So again, out of the box in Microsoft 365, there's a feature that allows you to define an expiration date for a particular group. And then what's going to happen if you assign that policy, if that group or that team is inactive for a certain period of time, it's going to go send an email to the owners, ask the owners what they want to do, and the owners can make a choice around that also. Next thing I would also say from a governance perspective is around templates, right? So this kind of falls into the provisioning piece. Again, having people use templates to create these teams, create these SharePoint sites can be really, really beneficial, both from a governance perspective, so at least you have some standardization across these teams, but also from the perspective of adoption also, right? It's much different giving users, something like a project team template where maybe they have some channels pre-configured, they have some apps and they have some tabs, rather than expecting them to do it themselves. And then also, so once you've done kind of the creation side, the naming policy, guest access, the other one as well is really from a policy perspective. So then you're looking at some of the more compliance features, things like retention, e-discovery, DLP, and of course, you're going to monitor all of this as well. Now, the last thing I would also mention here, and Doug, you actually did me a huge favor because it's a very good segue, is around ownerless groups and members. Now, this was just released, I think, a couple of weeks ago. So let me share my browser here because we're going to jump into here. Now, I assume everyone can see, but if not, just get on the mic and scream hysterically if you can. This is really new functionality. Now, I think this was only written a couple of weeks ago, but there is a way now to manage ownerless teams and groups directly through Microsoft 365. I'm not sure if people know about this, but essentially what this is a new feature. It's configured in the most odd of places, but that's the way that it is in Microsoft 365. Essentially what you can do is M365 will see if there's an ownerless or a memberless group available there, and then if there is, you can send an email to those people, which can be really, really useful. So I'll show you where this is configured because this doesn't make any sense to me either, but it is what it is. So you got to go to the admin center, settings, org settings. All seems very, very obvious, of course. If you click into Microsoft Groups here, there is now a new option that should come up called Ownerless Groups. If you click onto here, you can go through this process. So if I click on configure policy, this is going to come up. So I'm going to say that if we find an ownerless group, right, what we're going to do, we're going to send an email to, and you can, like I said, choose to all active members, only certain active members, right? So let's say we're going to send a email to all of the active members. 5 of them is probably the most, right? How active they are. So all of these kind of options through here. Where is this email coming from? So this is kind of neat. It can actually come on behalf of like an admin or an individual. We can put your own message through here. You can put a policy guideline URL, which is pretty neat. And you can apply this to all groups as well. And then you can click on finish, and this is going to run for you, right? And it runs kind of once a week or so. So like I said, some super, super powerful capabilities through here. Of course, they're failed. As you can see, this is new functionality. However, this hopefully is going to help you within the future also. So once again, this is really, really new functionality. I thought that I would kind of show you this as well, just to make sure. All right. Let's get back to the presentation here. Hopefully that helps, because that is something that's kind of new from what I know through here as well. All right, so let me stop sharing. Let me go back to this presentation.
Hey, Michael, sorry.
Yeah,
I
go ahead,
actually
Doug.
have a quick question on this. Hopefully it's somebody else's question, not just mine, but do you go through material for any training purposes to help owners actually manage their groups? Like if you are assigning somebody ownership, how do you teach them, here's what your responsibility is? I've had that gap at a lot of places.
Yeah, so so we do. I mean, we definitely try to encourage organizations to do that. It's a little bit more difficult, Doug, if everyone can create anything, if you know what I mean. So typically what we find, and we'll talk about this, but one approach that we've seen that works really well, if you want to enable self provisioning, you don't have to enable it for everyone. So I see with a lot of organizations, what they do is they say, okay, if you want to go and request a team or a group, for instance, what you have to do is essentially go through some training, and then we're going to allow you to go through the request process. And that group ownership thing is really things like I said, understanding permissions, understanding what owners can do, what members can do also. But also the other thing that we find that can be really useful from owners in particular is understanding what not to change, Doug, if that makes sense. So things like don't change your sensitivity label, for instance, right? Or don't change the name of your group or your team, because like I said, as an owner, you do have a lot of power there. But like I said, what we typically find works really well is before someone can go and request a team, they go through a little bit of training. Maybe it's an hour, right? It has to be really, really short because people aren't going to sit there and do it forever. But understand that if you're a team owner, you have the responsibility around the guests that you have, around the users that you have, and around the owners, and around the kind of content and what you can do within there also.
Awesome.
Thank
Thank you very much. Yep.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so let's keep going here. And if you can hear a baby crying, which you might be able to, or maybe the Teams thing is there, that's my daughter. She's a little bit sick. And if you've ever had a 3-year-old toddler who's got a cold, you know that it's almost like the end of the world for them. So if you're hearing her crying there, I apologize. All right, how do we implement all of this stuff? So let's talk about everyone's favorite part of the session, pragmatic governance scenarios. So I think this is going to add a little bit more context to how are we going to do this. Now, remember what I said before, we are going to take the role of 3 different organizations, because remember, every organization a little bit different. And I want to show you in terms of these pieces how this is going to look like. So we're going to have 3 different companies that we're essentially going to pretend we're going to be. The first is going to be Lockdown Corp. Now, I don't know if anyone is Lockdown Corp within this chat. If you are, you can put down you can put up your hand or something. Lockdown Corp, any one of these governance scenarios that we're going to go through, they're going to lean to very heavily lockdown settings. So Ross, you're part of Lockdown Corp, and Carl, awesome, perfect. So this might be good for you folks. We are going to lock everything down here, right? It's going to be a little bit tough. I'm probably going to say some disparaging things about Lockdown Corp, so I apologize, but I want to show you just how far you can lock everything down. All the way on the other side, we are going to have Startup Inc. Now, do we have any people in kind of Startup Inc. here? You can kind of maybe use one of the reactions or whatever here. Matt, do you have a question, or did you raise your hand by accident here? And let me know if you want to jump off mute here.
Oh, just raised it by accident.
Yeah, all good, mate. All good. Perfect. So on the other side, we got Startup Inc. Now, Startup Inc., one of these companies, right? I don't know what they make. It's probably to do with Web3, blockchain technology, right? They got $360 billion in funding. They have an office. The office has its own baristas, probably beanbags, right? What I'm trying to say is Startup Inc., they don't care what their users can do. They just want to grow as fast as possible. So they're going to have everything open. Now, friends, if your organization is working like Lockdown Corp, but you haven't changed any settings within your Microsoft 365 teams out of the box, you are functioning like Startup Inc. Now, I want to make that really clear, because a lot of companies think that by default, the kind of default options in Microsoft 365 are very, very closed. They're not. They lean heavily towards these open settings. So it's something that's kind of really, really important to note. And then the third one is going to be balanced industries. Now, balanced industries is going to take an approach where I wish more organizations would take, where there's a balance. So they're going to balance between the IT needs that they have and then the end user needs also, right? So we're going to go through these 3 scenarios and kind of show you how each one of these organizations would implement them. Because like I said, there's going to be a lot of different people from a lot of different groups. All right, let's talk about the first one. We've talked about this already in the chat here, but it's probably the first one to start off with, around teams creation. So your decision point here is essentially going to be who can create groups and teams within your organization, right? Fairly simple. like I said, the considerations around this is really to control sprawl, control duplication of content, enforce some structure, but the cost is self-service. And then it's typically additional load on someone. And that additional load is going to be the IT team also, right? Now, if you are going to lock this down, it's fairly easy to do. Microsoft doesn't actually make it that easy. I'm pretty sure they don't make it that easy by choice, but it's fairly simple, right? A little bit of kind of PowerShell, right? There's some scripts that are available, super simple, super easy. But then if you're going to lock all of this stuff down, people will need to have another way to request these pieces, right? So it has to be a flow, a Power App, a third-party tool, maybe another system, smoke signals, whatever it is. There needs to be another way that users can go and request teams, groups, and SharePoint sites. The other unfortunate byproduct of this is that there's no real way to lock down teams creation. You're locking down group creation, which means people are not going to be able to create teams. They're not going to be able to create groups. They're not going to be able to create SharePoint team sites either, because that's part of the group. They're not going to be able to create planner plans by themselves, because they're also part of a group also as well, right? So there's some other kinds of things you need to consider that. But this is, like I said, one of the most common things that we find that organizations do. So what are these scenarios? So Lockdown Corp, they're going to disable the creation of this, right? And they're going to use a tool, basically, right? So again, they're going to use some sort of tool, maybe it's a Power App, for instance, to get users to go through that provisioning process. Typically what happens, someone will go in, request a team. What's nice about having a form is you can capture a whole range of additional information also, and you can enforce additional governance structure. So if someone goes through a tool, you can say you need at least 2 owners, you need at least 2 members. We have to understand the purpose of the team. We have to understand if there's any sensitive information there, what type of template. There's a lot of additional information that you can gather. But Lockdown Corp is going to lock everything down. Balanced Industries is kind of an interesting one. And I think, Doug, we kind of chatted about this earlier, but I really like this approach. And a lot more kind of organizations going to this. So they're saying, we are going to allow you to create teams and groups and SharePoint sites, but you need to go through some sort of training to understand what exactly that involves, right? Now, that training can be a half-an-hour training course, an hour, whatever that is. The nice thing is, with the out-of-the-box approach, you can lock down group creation for just a subset of users. So it's really easy to do where you have where you have an active directory group. You call it people who can create teams or something like that. As these users go through training, they go into that group, and then they can go into the native UI and start requesting teams and SharePoint sites and everything else. And the last is kind of Startup Inc., right? So Startup Inc. here, again, this is the out-of-the-box approach. So users can go and create as many teams and as many groups and as many SharePoint sites as they like. Now, I've seen close to, I don't know, 500 organizations, maybe in the history of Orchestry, a lot of teams. I can probably count on one hand the amount of organizations that have had really good long-term sustained success by just allowing people to create anything. It's typically smaller organizations that are very, very highly tech savvy, right? So it's like tech companies where they kind of understand what they're doing. Most of the time, though, we find that over time, it's really great from an adoption perspective, so let anyone can create anything, but again, it kind of falls down over time. Now, what you might be asking, well, if that's the case, why doesn't Microsoft make it more difficult or introduce kind of more control around this? Well, you have to think of it from Microsoft's perspective, right? I mean, they want you to get your content into their cloud as quick as you can, because once it goes in, it's never coming out there. So they want to, it's not in their best interest to introduce any friction within this process. That's why it's so open. Like I said, it can work well for some organizations, but in a lot of times, you want to have a little bit more process around that. Okay. Next thing we're going to talk about is one of the pieces that I think we haven't covered, but is super interesting, around this concept of default and available apps, right? Your governance decision point here is twofold. So A, it's what applications do we want to give our users access to? And B, do we want to default any apps for our users. Now, this is one of these capabilities which we don't see many organizations using, which I think is a shame because it's super powerful, right? So your decision points or your considerations here are maybe there's certain custom apps that you want to promote within your organization. So a really good example of a custom app is Microsoft Viva, right? If you're deploying Viva into your organization, that's a custom app. You can actually have policies that allow you to pin that app to everyone's team, right? So they don't have to go and find it. They don't have to do anything. They just come into work and that app is essentially there. The other thing that you can also do, though, is control which of the, I don't know how many third-party teams apps there are now. I think there's like 1,500. Which of the 1,500 apps do you want users to have access to? Remember that by default, if you haven't changed any of these settings, essentially any user can go and add any app from the Teams App Store into their teams, right? And I think that at the moment, there is, actually I'll give you a live counter here, people. There is at the moment manage apps here. 1 second. So as of right now, there's 1,509 apps within the third-party store. Now, you might not want your users to have access to 1,509 different apps. You can control it as well. And it can work really well, both from a governance perspective. It can also work really well from an adoption perspective also, right? So what we find in a lot of companies, and I'll give you a really good example. In a lot of companies, most users don't know that there's task planning capabilities available within Microsoft 365. I know it sounds odd, but they don't. But so what they do is they'll go into Teams. They don't know that there's like a native task management capability like Microsoft Lists or Planner. They'll go into the Teams App Store and they'll start using something like Asana or Monday or Smartsheet, right? What you can do is you can limit the access to those third-party apps for them and then maybe promote the internal or the out-of-the-box native capabilities through that. Okay, so how do we control this? So how do we both control what apps are available and how do we also kind of pin apps for people? Now, in this case, there's kind of 3 things you need to set up here. This is like a combo job. It's an application setup policy, an application permission policy, and an org-wide app setting as well. For our folks at Lockdown Corp here. So Lockdown Corp, no apps are basically going to be made available. They're not going to allow users to add any personal apps. They're also not going to allow users to pin apps. You even have that control there, right? That users can't even pin their own personalized app on the left-hand side. So Lockdown Corp, they want to control the experience for teams, and they really don't want them to have access to any third-party apps, custom apps, or anything like that. So on the org-wide setting, what they're going to do, they're going to disable access for all of the third-party apps, right? They're going to disable the access for custom apps. Now, this custom apps one, just be careful with this one here, particularly if you're rolling out Viva, because if you disable this, what's going to happen is your Viva intranet app that you have, your Viva Connections app, is not going to work, or it's going to stop working, or it's just not going to appear because it is defined as a custom app. So you're gonna have to be careful. But Lockdown Corp is going to block all of them. They're going to have an application permission policy that's going to block all of the Microsoft apps, all of the third-party apps, and all of the custom apps. Now, when it says block Microsoft apps here, just so you know, it's not going to be all of the Microsoft apps. You still have access to things like SharePoint and List and some of these other pieces. It's some of these other apps like Poly and a bunch of other ones that Microsoft provides. And then the final thing is in the app setup policy. So they're not going to allow users to upload their own apps. They're not going to allow users to pin their apps. Basically, what they see is what they get on the left-hand side, right? So pretty locked down. But like I said, super simple to do with some configuration. For balanced industries, this is what we're seeing more and more of, right? So once again, what they're saying here is they're going to allow third-party apps, but this is a really subtle, interesting option, right? So they're going to allow third-party apps from today, but any additional apps that get added to the App Store, they have to go through a review process. And there's constantly third-party apps coming out into the Teams App Store. So if you want control around that, you can do that as well. They are going to allow custom apps because maybe they want to have Viva connections. But what they're going to do, they're going to use an app permission policy to be able to control exactly what users have access to. So they're okay with the Microsoft apps, but with the third-party apps, what they're going to do is like, well, we don't want people to have access to all of the third-party apps because, frankly, a lot of them are terrible. what we're going to do is just give them the ability to choose from, a subset of apps that we know that we've paid for within our organization. So in this case, the Adobe Creative Cloud here, Jira, and Stack Overflow. And then they're also going to have a custom app. It could be something as awesome as Orchestrate, or it could be your Viva intranet connections app, which is there. So like I said, a really good approach, right? And what we find here is it can work really well, because again, think of it from an end user perspective. If I go and add an app and I have like 1,500 apps in Teams that are all third party, it does become a little bit confusing. The nice thing here is, again, you can kind of target those pieces through there as well. And on the app setup policy, what they're going to do is pin that app automatically to people. And remember, when I talked about settings and policies, remember that these policies can be defined as subset of users. So for instance, maybe for marketing, we automatically default the intranet connections app, right, pinned, and the Adobe Creative Cloud, whereas maybe for something like IT, for instance, we have Jira and we have Stack Overflow for Teams there as well. So again, it's kind of using governance from an adoption perspective as well. So you've got a lot of flexibility here. You can create as many of these policies as you want. You can kind of pin them to wherever you need to. And then the final thing is around Startup Inc. So Startup Inc. has everything open, right? So I can add any third-party apps. Any third-party apps now in the future are good. Add any custom apps, all good with any app that sits within the App Store. And essentially users can go and add their own apps and do all of that sort of stuff. Again, this is the default approach in Microsoft 365. If you haven't changed anything, this is what you're going to get through here as well. So just be careful. Let's talk about the next one. Teams naming policies. I know that we've covered we've had a bit of a conversation around this, but really, like I said, the decision point around this is you want to enforce conventions on how teams and really groups are going to be named within your organization. As you know, it can have a massive impact on findability. Finding teams through team search, as you know, is bad enough. It's really bad if things are named something completely different all of the time. Now, the good thing is that Microsoft 365 has a capability around this. It's called a group naming policy. The bad thing is that it's at the group level, right? Which in my mind kind of makes it a little bit useless, because you want to have probably different naming policies for different types of teams. So for instance, maybe all of your projects, you want to have prefixed with PRJ or PROJ, but all of your department teams, maybe you want to prefix that with DEPT. If you want to go down that process and have those rules, you're looking at a third-party tool where you're looking at custom code. But at least there is some capabilities here within Microsoft 365 that can help you. Couple of things though, particularly from a team owner perspective. Team owners can go and change the name of their team whenever they want, right? That can be really, really problematic for some organizations. It's one of the reasons that we talked about training. But really, as a team owner, you can go and change a sensitivity label, which could be a huge issue. And you can also go and change the name of the team whenever you like. So that's something to consider also. There's no way of locking that down either, right? There's no way of doing that. The other thing with this capability also is that you also need to have an Azure AD P1 license. Most of you are going to have that if you're running E3 or E5s, but in some of the older kind of license models, it wasn't there also. Now, naming policies can have a huge impact, right? And one of the things that kind of our tool does, which people really love, is we have a lot of really fine-grained capabilities around naming in particular. And on the left-hand side, we have a bunch of teams which are kind of named, pretty well here, right? Not too bad. But just by adding some additional naming policies here, you can actually make this much more obvious of what this content is. So some examples that we see that work really well for project teams and sites, prefixing all of your groups and all of your teams by type can work really well. So PRJ for projects, DEPT for departments, if it's a committee, COM, if it's a class in an educational context, CLASS for instance. But for projects, prefixing it with PRJ, dash the project ID, and then the descriptive name can work really, really well. For departments, same sort of thing, DPT, classification, and the department name. We find a lot of organizations are also looking at if they've got guest access, making sure that users really understand that guests are part of that team. We see some organizations putting an EXT or guest within the name of the team and the group itself. For multinational teams, a lot of organizations put in like the geography and the business unit and then the descriptive name. And then here's an example from actually Harvard that they actually use. They put in the organization or the school name, the department name, and then the descriptive name through there. I really think this is really useful. Like I said, it can be a really, really powerful way both to help users find teams, help to organize teams also. And like I said, there's a pretty marked difference from the ones we see on the left-hand side, even though these names are pretty good, to the right-hand side. So for instance, retail, we know that retail is a department now, right? Because we have DEPT in front of it also. We know that, Project Alpha and Product Beta Research, these are all projects, for instance. And we know that Contoso is part of the US HR group, right? So really, really simple things, really, really easy. Again, out of the box, there's probably not as much flexibility as one would think, but it is possible to do. And it's definitely possible to do if you have a provisioning process or if you're using a custom tool also. All right, let's keep going on here, team. Oh, we've got a couple of questions here. All right, Ross Eaton, thank you. With changing the name, when changing the name of the team, are they able to change the prefix or suffix that they chose? If they change it post provisioning, Ross, I assume you're asking. So after, it's a good question. I don't think they are, to be honest with you, but I'm not too sure. I know what you're asking. So I assume you're asking if you have a naming convention, there's a prefix or a suffix, right? So you're good, and then an owner goes in and changes that post. I don't think they can, but I'm not sure. I know it's probably not the answer you want to hear. I know that at least on the group side, that's gonna stay, but I don't know if they can change the name of the team there as well. And Marie, can a team be typed and then restricted to app types?
I'll jump in there just one second. I mean, that's not quite clear. I'm just wondering if a team can be typed, like to say to be of a project type, and then you can, if apps are also typed, then can you just allow, just apps that are project-based to be added to that team? So you define the purpose of the team by typing it and then restrict access to apps based on that type. Is that possible?
Not out of the box. It's something that Orchestra does, though.
Because that would be really useful.
Yeah, not out of the box. No, I mean, the only way to do it, Marie, would be you default those apps as part of that template. So at least they're there for people. So they're less likely to go looking around. But no, there's no, I know what you're asking. No, there's no concept of being able to restrict the available apps based on a team template.
Yeah, well, I suppose the apps would have to be typed too, right? So that's a kind of a level of thinking. Are apps typed out there? I'm not sure about that, but I just thought that would be a really useful concept to have.
Yeah, no, so it's not. I mean, the way that we get around it with Orchestra, just so you know, is that we would have those apps already provisioned within that team and within that template there, ready to go. So people would be very, they'll be less likely to go and hunt around for those pieces.
Right.
But no, there's no concept of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, great question. All right, let's go to the next one. Team owner and member settings. Now, I think this will be a kind of good segue because we're getting a few things around teams. Now, you can actually, there's not much control you can configure in terms of what team owners can do, which is a real pain for a lot of customers. However, there is a lot of control in terms of what you allow your team members to do. A lot of control within here. So kind of the decision point around this, and once again, this is something you consider, is how much power do you want your members to be able to have in teams? Now, by default, members have a lot of power. They can create channels, they can delete channels, they can delete tabs. If you're new to teams, it can be really, really problematic because I'll give you an example. A lot of times a member thinks they're just deleting a tab for themselves, and they're actually deleting the tab for the entire team. Now, for most tabs, that's not an issue. For the wiki, it's a big issue, because if someone goes in and deletes that wiki tab and there's wiki content in there, that content is like gone into the ether, right? So that's one of the use cases that we hear a lot of, that, members are going in, they're deleting apps, they're deleting, they're deleting channels, they don't really know what they're doing. So you can actually control a lot of this as well. Now, the way that this is controlled is on the member permissions under the setting of each team. You can also template these out, just so you know. So either out of the box in M365, if you're using the out of the box Microsoft templates, you can actually control what members can do through here. A lot of organizations don't, and I think it's actually really, really useful. So let's go through a few scenarios here. So the first is Lockdown Corp. Now, Lockdown Corp is basically wants to control what members can do. So they're going to disable every single option for members within a team. So also, because Lockdown Corp is highly regulated, they're not even going to allow members the ability to edit or delete any of the messages they post within chat. You can get down to that level, and maybe because they're doing that because everything is essentially regarded as an official record. Now, if you do this and you're a member of a team, essentially the only thing you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to post messages within the team's channels. You're not going to be able to edit your messages or delete them. So just be careful with what you write. And if you spell as bad as me, it's going to be a disaster for you. But there you go. And then the only thing they can do, they can't add tabs, they can't add channels. They can essentially go and kind of work in the structure of that team. They can go and add documents, right, and do all of that piece, but they can't do things like add channels, add apps, remove tabs, none of that stuff, right? So it's kind of quite a limited experience for them. Let's go all the way to the other side, though, which is Startup Inc. So Startup Inc., like I said, by default, is just going to use the default options. And by default, members had a lot of leeway in what they want to do. They can create private channels if you have that thing enabled. They can update channels. They can delete channels. They can add custom apps. They can remove tabs, remove connectors, do all of these pieces. Now, again, for some organizations, this might work really, really well. But particularly, we find that with organizations that are new to teams and members which are new to teams, this can become a little bit problematic also. So one of the options that we find that works really well is what our good friends at Balance Industries are doing. So Balance Industries allows anyone to become a team member without training, so they can go and become members, but they kind of want site owners to control the structure of that team, because the problem is, out of the box by default, a member can fundamentally change the structure of a team. They can create additional channels, they can delete channels, and do all of that stuff. So in this approach, what essentially is happening is that team owners control like the structure of that team. So they control the channels that get created, and they control the main apps on that team. But what members can do, members can maybe go and add tabs at the channels that already exist. They can go and add connectors, which no one uses. And they can go and add and delete their messages. So it's a little bit more of a balanced approach, where your owner is responsible for the actual structure of the team, whereas the members can go and add tabs, but they can't go and delete channels. They can't go and delete apps through there. So I really like this approach. Like I said, it's a kind of a nice balanced approach through there. I personally think that kind of team members have way too much control, right, in terms of what they can do there also. All right, so let's go to the next one here, and let's talk about this one, which is a really interesting one. So Teams messages settings. Now, this is a really fascinating one for me, because I know that no one uses this, which is a real shame. So this one is interesting because this actually allows you to control what type of actions users can do and perform using chat and channel messages within Teams. I don't know if anyone uses these options. If you are, maybe just drop a comment within here. Like I said, it allows you to control what users can do. I really like this approach as well, because it's a really good example of using some of these governance tools to be able to control things from a user adoption perspective. For the people that just don't like fun, it also allows you to control the fun stuff like Giphies, right? And memes and stickers, all of the stuff that makes Teams conversations useful. Unfortunately, you can remove this also. We heard from a lot of organizations that now that Giphy has been purchased by Facebook, right? They kind of wanted to remove that feature also, which is a little bit problematic. But again, the thing is you can actually control what users and can do through here. So let's talk about the first one. So Lockdown Corp wants to stay very professional through here. So they're basically going to lock everything down. So they're not allowing users to delete or edit their messages. We have seen this with a couple of customers. It really stops people from just using messages, right? Like if you can't delete or even edit your messages, it can be a little bit problematic. They've also turned off read receipts because they don't like that. We also see a lot of organizations turn off message translation also. So out of the box, you know, there's a capability to translate messages. We find in a lot of very heavily regulated industries, they want to turn that capability off, because the last thing you want to do is, you know, God forbid, Google Translate or whatever translation tool it uses mistakes that translations. There's some miscommunication, which results in something, for instance. But again, you've got lots of options through here, right? So in this case, we're not going to allow owners to delete their messages, right? Or their sent messages, or even edit their messages through here. There's no Giphies available. There's no memes. There's no stickers, right? That's a real shame, people. That's a real shame. That's half the fun. They're going to allow URL previews, which is great. They're not going to allow message translation also, no voice messages, right? All of that stuff. Basically, like I said, they're really kind of locked this down. So you can go down this route and have this very heavily locked down through here if you want to also. This other thing as well, so for balanced industries, they're going to go down for a little bit more kind of balanced approach. This is a really interesting one, though. So what balanced industries is doing is there was a couple of new features in Teams. It was a while ago now. So priority notifications is one of those features. If you've never used it, essentially you can set a chat message to someone, and if you send a priority notification, it's going to like ping them. I think it's every 2 minutes or every 20 minutes. It can be awesome. It can also drive people crazy. But once again, it's one of the kind of things where this is a good example that you can use these kind of capabilities to delay the rollout of features, give you a chance to train your users, and then roll them out again. So what Balanced Industries is going to do is basically they're going to disable that send urgent messages using high priority notifications feature. They're going to turn that off for now, do a little bit of training with their users, and then turn it back on, right? So, you know, you typically don't have much control in Microsoft 365 in terms of being able to control where certain capabilities light up for users. This is one example where you can use some of these governance policies to be able to do that. There's a lot more, but I thought I'd just kind of add that in there to make sure that it's useful. And then the final thing is around what we call messaging settings for Startup Inc. Now, Startup Inc., pretty simple. They are going to essentially use the default, right? And by default, you can do anything basically. Delete messages, edit messages, send them, use Giphies, all of that sort of stuff. So again, if you haven't gone in and changed any of these items, right, make sure that you go in, you look at these. The nice thing again, as with all of these features, you can have a setting and you can have a policy as well for individuals through here. So you've got that option. All right, one more here to go. Teams meeting settings. Now, a little bit off topic, I guess, because we're going to talk a little bit about Teams meetings. But again, there's a lot of settings and a lot of things that you can do to control that Teams meeting experience for users and organizations. Now, there is a ton of options within Teams meetings. We're not going to go through all of them, but what we're going to do is talk about how users should be able to share content during a Teams meeting, and also what guests should be allowed to do during a Teams meeting also. Now, like I said, there is a ton of meeting settings and a ton of policies here. I just wanted to outline two of these because these are two of the kind of the biggest issues that we find with customers also. Oh, go ahead, Doug. Jump.
Thank you. I just want to give you about a 15-minute heads up. Been wanting to find a good spot for you to go.
Awesome.
Interrupt you. Yep. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, perfect. So again, here, like I said, the two biggest issues we've heard from customers with meetings. A is people sharing things accidentally. Have you ever been on a call where someone's sharing their screen? And what happens is, so let's say I'm on a call with Doug, right? And I have a spreadsheet open, which is, I don't know, salaries of all of the people that work for me, right? Now, I accidentally share my screen, and for a split second, Doug maybe views that spreadsheet, right? That information leak is amazingly common. So what you can do with these Teams meeting settings, you can actually limit how people can share things. So that's one thing. The other thing is guests, right? So what can guests do within meetings, right? Again, you can control all of these as well really quickly and really, really easily. So let's look at what Lockdown Corp will do. So Lockdown Corp, understandably, has had some issues with data leaks in the past. So they're understandably hesitant. They're not going to allow anonymous users to join meetings. And in addition, they've also got it here that the person running the meeting, they can't share their screen. They can't really share anything. The only thing they can share is a PowerPoint presentation through here. So with these options in the meeting policy, they've disabled the whiteboard. There's no shared notes. Anonymous people can't start meetings, all of that stuff. Essentially, if you're in a meeting in Lockdown Corp, the only thing you can share is a PowerPoint presentation. You can't share anything else. Now, it's a little bit extreme, I know, but like I said, Lockdown Corp is a pretty extreme company through here, so you might want to look at that. But you have got a lot of control there. Balance Industries, once again, a little bit more balanced through here. So again, what they've done, they are allowing anonymous users to be able to join a meeting. On the right-hand side here, though, they're not going to allow anonymous users to start a meeting through here. So actually, someone from the organization has to be at the meetings through here. And what they've also done here, the screen sharing mode, which is kind of neat, is they've changed the screen sharing mode to anything to a single app. So what that means is that the experience of a person running this meeting, what's going to happen is when they choose to share something, they can't share their desktop. They actually have to share an individual app, right? So again, you've got the options to do that. And it's quite nice from a security perspective. The other thing that they're also doing is they're disallowing the ability for an external participant to give or request control through here. So again, for some organizations, we're all in IT. I'm sure we've done this where, in the old days, you start off a meeting and you're like, I can take control of your, screen, and you kind of move it around, but it's moving on their screen and so forth. We know a lot of companies doing that through Teams now. You can actually control and do that as well. And then finally, Startup Inc. Is it going to allow anyone to do anything? Again, these are the default options, people. So they're going to allow screen sharing for the entire screen and participants to request control and all of this good stuff. Again, like I said, there's kind of lots and lots of things that you can do here. Again, if you haven't changed these options, even though your company might be Lockdown Corp, your Teams is functioning like Startup Inc. So be careful around that as well. All right, there's a lot. We went through a lot, people. We went through a lot. I know. There's a lot there, but let's go through some key conclusions and takeaways, and then we will jump into some questions. So as you can probably tell, there's a lot to this governance space, right? Start off with the simple stuff. Look at the provisioning process, naming policies, a little bit around lifecycle management, right? Can be really, really useful. Again, what I would say, though, is make sure that you are not Startup Inc. Probably don't want to be Lockdown Corp. You probably want to be Balanced Industries, right? Really look at how you can use governance to drive adoption, as well as making sure that you adhere to all of the policies and everything else within your organization also. The next thing that I would also say is there's a lot of options there within Microsoft 365 with that Teams Admin Center and everything else, but they're just out of the box configuration, right? You can have a lot of flexibility there. If something doesn't work, you can go and change it also. So I wouldn't say go and play around with these options, but learn about what these options are. They can provide an incredible amount of value, especially if you're going to just do some point and click through there. And again, make sure you communicate this to all of your users, right? Especially for some of you who are like, well, we've got a mess. We're just going to turn off the creation process of Teams, and then we're just going to let, we're going to go through another thing. Users are probably going to be a little bit apprehensive around that. So whatever process you go down, make sure that, like I said, you communicate that to your users also. So I want to thank you all again. I know this has been a lot of info. I hope it's useful. You've been awesome. And let me turn it over to any questions that we have here, if we do, or anything else. Feel free to shout random things, type things, and let me know if any of this is useful and if you have any questions. Oh, by the way, if you want the presentation, just drop me an email, mike@orchestry.com. I think the good folks here from Minnesota are going to share it also. But like I said, if you need the actual presentation, just let me know, ping me, and I'll be more than happy to share it with you also.
And hey, Michael, thank you so much. This has actually been very fascinating and awesome to listen to. Marie has a question in chat on what does Orchestry do for teams?
Marie,
Sorry,
I
need
won't
to know.
Yeah, I won't. Let's do it offline, because I don't want to do a sales job here, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Because
Perfect.
Not that I don't want all of you to be customers, but I don't want to turn this into sales. But just I'll get your details, or just ping me, Marie, and then we'll go through this. It does a lot. I mean, basically, all of the stuff that I talked about, which I'm like, I really wish it did this. That's kind of why we built Orchestry, right? Because there are a lot of gaps there, and we just wanted to make it a little bit simpler. So, but that's not to say, listen, that's not to say that you need Orchestry. Of course, I'd like you to buy Orchestry, but you want to make sure you use some of these out of the box pieces first. But we know that a lot of organizations have some additional kind of requirements, which we can help you with.
Sure. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Awesome.
We have about 8 minutes left or so, and I'm just going to set up our wheel of random here for everybody who's participated, of course. So again, greatly appreciate it.
So hang on, before we go here, Doug, I have a question for the audience here. So I've never been to Minnesota, but I used to be a chef. So what is the traditional most popular food in Minnesota? Like what are you folks famous for?
Hot dish?
Yeah, let's go hot dish. Yeah, let's.
I don't eat a lot of it. Juicy Lucy's a popular one for sure. Hot dishes, I think, are just the generic go-to for Minnesotan, which is basically a conglomerate of whatever you had in your cupboard.
Okay, right. So it's like a scramble? Like you just put a whole bunch of stuff in a frying pan, or is it like an actual dish here?
Somebody who eats or makes hot dishes, please. Yeah, casserole, exactly.
Casserole. Got it.
Like Thanks. A casserole. I mean, I think mine is definitely the whole
hot dish,
potato hash brown type hot dish.
And a Juicy Lucy is that hamburger with the cheese in the middle, right?
Yes.
Like in the actual patty.
Like a stuffed burger. Yep.
Yeah, this I can get behind for sure. And then what is it lutefisk? No, lutefisk.
Lutefisk.
What is that?
Is something disgusting that I will never touch.
Oh, is it it's not like the fermented shark in it's not that, is it?
Lutefisk is a fish that is mostly inedible until it's soaked in lye,
right?
To soften it up, and then it has to be cleaned because the lye is poisonous, of course. So yeah, it's weird.
This sounds tremendous. All right, perfect. Old fish. Okay, awesome. No, that's great. Okay, this is awesome. I hope you learned something new, because I definitely learned something new today. Awesome. Juicy. Yeah, I've heard about the Juicy Lucy thing, which I have to say I like the idea of. Maybe
they can be really good. I do want to announce our winner though real quick. So Ross Eaton, I believe that I pronounced your name completely correctly. So congratulations, Ross. If I will grab your information if I can from the meeting. Otherwise, I will let you know.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you so much. I'll jump off here, because I know if you've got another session, you probably need a break as well. But really appreciate it. Thank you, Doug, for organizing this and having me. And like I said, any questions, feel free to reach out. Stay tuned for Nikki as well, because she's much smarter and she's much better than me. So it's well worth sticking around for her as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Bye.